and welcome to Dregs of Wisdom with Andrew Tanner.
Hey everyone, we are here with Dregs of Wisdom episode 23. So excited to bring on a friend of mine, or really a friend of a friend, but someone who I've known for so many years. John Mongiovi is a board certified hypnotist and certified instructor of hypnotism. He's one of the most sought after hypnotists in New York City. He's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, CNBC. He has many clients who you've probably heard of, but I can't say their names. He helps athletes, he helps business performance, he helps artists. And he's also, interestingly enough, an expert in nonverbal hypnotism. He's not like one of those guys that does hypnotist shows that you may have seen on the online, but he's the kind of teacher that both a teacher and a practitioner that helps people make major changes in their life. And the reason he's here is because we're so excited. He'll be teaching and presenting at the Berkshire Yoga Festival this summer. And John, I'm so happy to have you here on the show. Thank you so much for coming.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And you're in New York City right now?
Yeah, I'm in New York with the noisy sirens outside and fall weather coming.
Yeah, so if we hear sirens, we're just going to bear through it. You know, I'm really grateful that you made time for us. For those that don't know, like I've done a hypnotist session with John. I had to book like 3 months in advance. He's very sought after for his craft, and he's very devoted to his craft. And I wanted to first share with you, maybe you could share a little bit about how you got into this practice. And then I'd love to get into mesmerism, which, you know, in the last conversation you and I had, you talked about bringing people back to the history of hypnosis and understanding mesmerism as a bigger concept than just, you know, thought, hypnotizing people with thought. And then maybe we'll get into some other esoteric stuff. So maybe let's start with just how did you get into this work and what's drawn you to this work?
You know, this is probably one of the most common questions that I get. It's either how did you get into this work, or when I tell people I'm a hypnotist, the other comment is, does that really work? So I prefer this question actually in terms of how you got into hypnosis. When I was in college, I saw a stage hypnotist come to school, and it really intrigued me. But even before that, when I was a little kid, I was very interested in anything that had to do with the strange phenomena of the mind. So if it was hypnotism or extrasensory perception, any psi phenomena, anything like that just really intrigued me. So when we were little and we would go to the library with my mom, I was always interested in going into that section of the library and checking out those books. And years later, I actually didn't realize this at the time, but I had my first experience with hypnotism when I was about 5 years old. I had a swing set accident where a swing busted my nose open, and I had to have over 200 stitches in a plastic surgery on my nose. And they didn't put me to sleep for the surgery. Of course, they numbed it, but what they did was they blew up a rubber glove and they draw the two eyes and the nose and the smiley face on it. And this is a pediatric hypnosis practice where the nurse or one of the people, they put the glove out there while you're lying on the table, and the eye fixation on the glove keeps you focused and concentrated. And it kept me, as a little 5-year-old kid, calm for this surgery that was a pretty long surgery to repair my nose. So I actually had a really early experience with hypnotism. And then, like I said, I was into reading about it. I got into studying a little bit more after college. But then some years later, I saw another stage hypnotist. And that's when I decided I need to learn how to do that, because I want to see, is this real? How does this work? And I really just wanted to challenge myself to be able to do traditional hypnotism.
Wow. Do you think that all of us are experiencing trance states all the time and not really realizing it? Or is it something that has to be activated on purpose, like with the hand that you were shown as a child, or the work that you do with clients?
I think that we all experience trance all the time. And I have to say that there are a variety of trance states. So like what people commonly call the flow state, which is the state of absorption, when you're really engaged in some task or project and time flies by, that's a trance state. When you're daydreaming, you're zoned out, so they say, that's a trance state. In fact, many of the things that we do, we go through automatic actions all day long.
Right. We drive, maybe not in New York City, you might not drive anymore, but you're driving and you're like, how did I just do that driving?
Yeah, the equivalent in New York City is you're on the subway train and you get to your stop and you're like, oh, I'm already there. Because and you can see people on the train where they're reading the advertisements up there, and then after a while the eyes go down, which is the sort of the same as the daydreaming state. The eyes are very important in hypnotism. And then, you see people just kind of in that trance. I think even more interestingly, what I would say in terms of us often being in trance states is that many of the problems that people have are trances. You can be in a fixation on an idea that is making you anxious. You can have let's say someone is a nail biter, and they're like really focused on those cuticles and getting that little piece of their nail. That's a trance state, because trance is a fixation of attention and a reduction of peripheral awareness. So we are very, very often in trance states. And I would even go so far as to say a lot of times my job as a hypnotist is to break the trance state and create a more positive trance state.
Yeah. So can you talk a little about that? What is the process? Someone has addiction. Like, addiction is a trance, right? It's a compulsion that people feel when they're in that when they're on the crest of that urge of needing to satisfy that addiction. Do you work with a lot of clients on addiction? Or is it more, I guess maybe you could describe how you'd work with someone with addiction, or how you might work with someone with performance anxiety, or that sort of thing.
I do work with a lot of clients who have addictions to food, cigarettes, vaping. If it comes down to, heavier drugs and things that are, let's say someone has an addiction to painkillers or something like that, this is out of the scope of what I work on, because there you really need to be working with a medical doctor or with a drug rehab type of person. But I do see people who have addictions to substances. I see a lot of people for fears and phobias, anxiety, panic attacks, performance anxiety, social anxiety, and just generally there are a lot of people who want to be motivated to do more in their lives and get a mental edge.
But what's the process of taking someone who's got that issue, like you were talking about earlier, breaking down the previous trance or the remembered trance? In yoga, we have the term samskara, or like a vasana, which is like a groove in the brain, like a past trauma, that sort of thing. How do you work with that in hypnotism? Or in mesmerism, by the way, if you want to pivot into that.
Yeah, I would mention mesmerism as part of that also, because there are some unique practices to be able to help someone get down to the bottom of where the issue comes from. Now, usually what the process is that I have a 2-hour initial intake, and half the time is spent in conversation, and the latter half of the appointment, we're actually doing the hypnosis. In that conversation, I'm already doing some conversational hypnosis. We're already starting to reframe things. And by having a bit of education and also taking the history, starting to help the person understand what's taking place and helping me understand also the origin of the problem. How do you get down to actually helping the person overcome, let's say, a smoking addiction or an addiction to biting the nails? I don't really think that I would use the word addiction for that, but that's more of a habit, a reflex. First of all, it is taking the history of when do you do this? Why do you do this? What do you like about this? Why do you want to stop? really taking a thorough history to get the motivations for the reason that they're there. How do you help the person overcome that? Sometimes people have the conception that in hypnotism that it's all about going back in your memory and finding the initial sensitizing experience, the ISE, for when this habit pattern started. And sometimes that is the case, but very often that's a misconception. Very often things just become habit, and it doesn't even matter sometimes why it started, because now it's something completely different.
I mean, my conception of it is, you walk in, the guy, the hypnotist kind of has a look into my eyes, or, follow the clock, the pendulum. And then, they say, like, from now on, you will not want to smoke, snap my fingers. Like, is that a real experience? Is that something that you do with clients, or is it more, it seems like you're more holistic in your approach.
There are some elements of that would match what you're saying, more in terms of nonverbal hypnotism. The look at me right here. I don't really often swing the pendulum, but I will use something for eye fixation. The pendulum swinging is usually, the interesting thing about the pendulum, since we're on the topic, is where the hypnotist holds it, because the pendulum is not here at eye level, it's down below eye level. And when our eyes go to a lower point, that is conducive to going into that trance state, because every time you daydream, your eyes go down toward the floor about 40 degrees below eye level and a little bit off to the left or the right. It's called the dark focus point, because when the accommodation muscles in your eyes that look close or distant go to complete rest, you go into a dark room where there's nothing to focus on, your eyes will actually go down to that point. And it's very consistent through your lifetime that there's a correlation between that visual fixation point and your trance state. So that's a little bit of a tangent to...
Well, no, that's a really, just want to say, that's so interesting to me, because every time I learn about hypnotism or NLP or things, I always feel like I'm learning the secrets of the universe. And I feel like as a yoga teacher, and a lot of yoga teachers listen to this podcast, the idea that, if I'm, guiding people to look downward in their meditation, that's going to have a very important effect. Versus, and Trataka is a meditation where you stare at a candle flame, but the location of the candle flame, I wouldn't have known that it matters.
I think it matters. Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt. Please continue that. I hope I can bring you back to where I interrupted you.
Yeah. The process. Let's say that someone comes to see me for smoking cessation.
Right.
In the conversation, I'm going to listen very carefully for the beliefs that they have, because we all have beliefs. That's part of our trance. So someone might say, I just can't get through an evening at home without breaking down and going to the smoke shop and buying another vape. There's a belief there. What I want to do is, once we're in hypnosis, I want to give them the complete opposite statement. I can't be free from this habit, is going to become, I can be free from this habit. I want to watch that. That's a little bit of a simplistic way of expressing that idea, but you want to listen for the beliefs that a person has, and generally speaking, feedback to them the opposite belief, or what is going to be the positive belief. So that's the basis of giving some verbal suggestions in hypnosis. So you're correct on that point, that once a person is in the trance state, you want to give them verbal suggestions because of this idea of hypersuggestibility. Once you're in the trance state, there is an increased suggestibility to the mind. And by the way, on that point, suggestibility is not naivete or gullibility. Suggestibility is the ability for an idea to really impress itself upon the mind. Sort of like when I go to the grocery store and then I come home and hours later I'm singing the song in my mind that I heard in the grocery store. That's a great example of suggestibility. So
let me ask you about, and I remember when we talked last, one of the talks we were thinking of having you do at the festival was principles of trance, suggestion, mesmerism, and magnetism. And maybe imagery was another one. We talked about some different things. I want to get into it sounds like we just discussed some of the principles of suggestion. I'm sure there's more. We could get into trance and imagery, but I want to hang on suggestion for a little bit more if we could, because in yoga, there are teachings in yoga. For example, the teaching of that what you really are is not an individual self, but you're an infinite, eternal, and whole part of the whole universe. This is kind of a core teaching of both Taoism, Vedanta, all the Far East traditions. The teaching is that you are a portion of the divine, but that your true nature is unified with everything. And my experience was that when I was studying with Dharmamitra during those years, I would do these very powerful 2-hour practices, probably putting myself in an extremely suggestible state. And then him just saying, be receptive to the grace within, or whatever he was saying. I then experienced that as my reality. I experienced feeling infinite, eternal, and whole. And that the knowledge or the feeling that was true became very real to me through practice over time. And that I keep digging that vasana deeper. And my question is does that make it real? Is it like, what are we doing here? Is that a good use of hypnotism as for yoga teachers, etc.? Is there anything unethical about that? Like, is that what's happening? And if so, how do you understand? How should people like what's to stop someone from going, oh, I was just brainwashed into thinking that? Do you know what I mean? How do you put all that in perspective?
I think that the first idea here is that a person will not accept a hypnotic suggestion that they are not willing to accept. So to the idea of someone saying, well, I was just brainwashed into this, at that moment, if they did accept the hypnotic suggestion, and let's say that 20 years ago you went through yoga training where your mentor or teacher gave you that suggestion and it has remained with you over the years. But then you say to yourself, wait a minute, I don't believe that anymore, which of course you're not going to say.
Well, there were other suggestions that I didn't believe. Right. And yeah.
And you would not incorporate those into your being, because the critical faculty, even in hypnosis, is always present. It in the faculty of psychological self-preservation is always present. So there's a huge misconception that many people have about hypnotism, that it is going to impose suggestions upon them that they're not willing to have imposed upon them. I do have to give one caveat with this, which is to say that the notion that you can't be hypnotized without your total willingness is not entirely true. You can be hypnotized without your willingness to be hypnotized. And to a certain degree, you can be affected by suggestions just like we are by advertising.
Right. All advertising is a form of suggestion.
But the person who watches the TV commercial for the big flame broiled juicy hamburger and goes out to get it is accepting that suggestion, where another person who eats very healthy food and doesn't eat hamburgers is not going to go out and eat a hamburger, right? So there's always a limitation on the suggestion that you're going to accept. I think the critical thing to verbal suggestions is the emotion that they evoke. And I'm pointing here because this is where we feel emotion, from about the jaw down to the navel and our sympathetic ganglion that travels down through our body, and also the imagery that words evoke. The value of a hypnotic suggestion is that it's creating an image and an emotion. It's not it's not that the words are going into the brain and typing in, a new belief, like entering a coding into a computer. It's that it evokes something within you that latches onto it at the moment that you're receiving the suggestion, and that's what changes you.
But so obviously, I mean, my personal belief is that the in yoga we call it knowledge, actually similar to gnosis in Gnosticism, and hopefully we can get into that a little later. Self-knowledge is the experience of experiencing one as beyond the individual. And I believe that is ethically a good thing to help suggest to people. Is there have you ever seen like an unethical use of suggestion? And is there anything that people should worry about when it comes to hypnotism or just in general to be more wary of?
I think that a person seeking hypnosis definitely should seek out an ethical practitioner. There's not really such a risk in hypnosis that a person is going to be under the influence of a nefarious motive and accept suggestions that they're not there to suggest. Like if someone comes to the hypnotist and the hypnotist says, gives them the suggestion that they're going to keep coming back for sessions and you're going to empty your wallet, or you're going to, I mean, these are ridiculous things that people think. But it doesn't really happen that way. No one is going to suggest, no one is going to accept a suggestion like that. In fact, if I give a suggestion that has nothing to do with the reason that the person is there and the agreed upon ideas in the conversation, it's actually going to be, it's going to jar them out of the hypnotic state and be contrary to my objective as their hypnotist. So I don't really think that there is such a concern when it comes to seeing a valid hypnotic practitioner. However, where you do see a nefarious use of hypnotism sometimes is in covert hypnotism. And I have seen, which means like people trying to gain
like,
influence.
Is this like CIA or like government stuff? Like what are you talking about?
I mean that, perhaps
using NLP
there are people who use hypnotism in ways that maybe I'm not aware of. I have seen things like that before. But what I really mean is there is, because people have some knowledge of hypnotism, and there is this idea that you can give people hypnotic suggestions and influence people in certain ways. I have seen people come to my office who have been negatively influenced by someone who's not a hypnotist, but who has learned hypnotic principles and has used that to gain some influence over them. And they've come to me feeling that they were hypnotized. And indeed, in some of those cases, they really were, by an amateur who has learned some techniques and principles and has used those for a nefarious purpose. I could count that probably on one hand, but they are definitely situations that I've seen where it impresses itself upon me how people really can wield this influence over other people if they know what they're doing.
Is that like neuro-linguistic programming? Is that mostly that kind of stuff? Or do you know anything about that field? Is that related?
Yeah, some of it can utilize neuro-linguistic programming, which is a sort of codification of some of the work of Milton Erickson, who was a very talented hypnotist many years ago. Some of his students kind of codified his teachings, and out of that later on through someone else came the field of what's called neuro-linguistic programming, which has a lot to do with how you specifically say things. But that's only maybe one aspect of it. For example, another aspect of it may be anchors and associations. Like every time I scratch my nose, I've done that when you're in a certain state of mind. And then now that I scratch my nose, it evokes that state of mind. I'm being very simplistic here about
but this is cool. Yeah.
I've seen that before.
So talk a little bit about the history of hypnosis and mesmerism, because this was the last time we and I spoke, you started to share about that. And I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. This is what I think yoga people should be most interested in, because it's like embodied hypnosis. I mean, I don't know, that's my term for it, but maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about that.
I am so glad that you asked me that question, because I love nonverbal hypnotism. And I've been training in nonverbal hypnotism in Italy over the last few years. This is my 20th year of practice, and I only recently got into nonverbal hypnotism. It does go along with the history of hypnotism. Most people, their conception of hypnosis when they come to my office is that we're going to have some conversation. They're going to then close their eyes, get into a relaxed state, and receive verbal suggestions to take advantage of that hypersuggestibility of the trance state. And let's use the terminology here that that you are implanting ideas into the mind, right, or influencing the unconscious through verbal suggestion, which, as I said before, is evoking imagery and emotion. And that is much of the practice of hypnotism. However, what most of the field of hypnotism has thrown away, and I don't say forgotten, but I say thrown away, and I'll explain why, is the old style, look me in the eyes and you're going into trance, instantaneous techniques, rapid hypnosis, using the gaze of the eyes, using what's known as fascination, which is a capacity that all animals have to become fascinated by something, like the cat that suddenly sees the piece of dust floating in the air and is watching it and completely fixated on it. These are aspects of how our brains work, how our eyes work. And there is also, I'll cut to the chase and say something about Mesmer and why I say that this was thrown away instead of forgotten. Mesmer, Franz Anton Mesmer, who lived in the mid to late 1700s in Europe, was healing thousands of people with what was before him called magnetism. There was an idea going way back ages ago that, it really starts with the studies of geology, which you might be thinking, where in the world is John Mongiovi going with this? But
I turned my head. I'm fascinated. Keep going, brother.
When people discovered lodestones, which are magnetic rocks, they began to have the idea that if this rock has magnetic poles, then the Earth, which is a giant rock, must have magnetic poles. This is where the first idea of the Earth having magnetic poles comes from. Well, out of this came the use of magnets and lodestones for healing. And this was taking place for a long, long time, that there were people interested in magnetism and healing.
When do you know approximately when that started potentially? Like, is it?
We're talking, it may be 1100s, 1200s. It could even be earlier than that. I'm saying that because Paracelsus, I think, was in the 14th century. So this goes back before Paracelsus.
And it's also like we have written access of stuff from the Middle Ages, but it's possible that there were prehistory, like there are cultures that have been completely wiped off the map, and magnetic healing is really fascinating because it's in my practice in Taoist yoga, we learn to feel the magnetic fields. The human body has a magnetic field, and you have a receptor in your nerves to feel it. So it's not magic. It's very easy for most people, even in their first lesson of Taoist yoga, to be able to feel the center of their palms as magnets, to be able to feel other places where there's a magnetic field. So I'm just so curious about this. Please continue. I think, yeah.
I think the way that you just put that is exactly what magnetism and mesmerism is about. Because Mesmer, after Paracelsus, and there was a Jesuit priest named Father Hell who was using steel.
Father Hell?
Father Hell, who was using steel plates for healing. And so there was this idea of healing with magnets. When Mesmer came around, he studied with people like this who came before him, but Mesmer brilliantly realized that he could do it without the magnets. He could do it with his hands. And so he came up with the idea of animal magnetism, and that there was a magnetic resonance in the hands, in the human body, as you've so well said. And what happened with him is that even though he did these thousands of healings of people, there was a commission that wanted to shut him down. And the commission, right, the commission called him a charlatan. And after that, Mesmer was essentially, I think he had to leave where he was. And since then, the whole field of hypnotism has regarded that aspect of hypnotism as charlatanry. And the field of hypnotism today really tends to negate things like stage hypnotism, mesmerism, magnetism. And I think that that's oftentimes in an effort to legitimize itself and appear more scientific. There is this this phenomenon that takes place generally in our society where we want to make something more valid by talking about the neuroscience behind it, or some idea of validating it based on a more scientific idea. And of course, I, as having a science background and degree in science, right, I appreciate that, but not everything is explainable in that way. Some things are experienced in our actual human experiences, and those things are just as real. So go ahead.
No, please continue. I'm thinking so many thoughts. With Mesmer, do you know where did he say the human or animal magnetism resides in the body besides the hands? Were there other points that he focused on?
I'm not sure about whether there were specific points in the body that Mesmer spoke of. I'm referring to the hands because one of the things that is used in mesmerism is the idea of magnetic passes, as they're called. And this is where, like, let's say that there's no one here, I could do this to myself. Is like if I'm doing this to someone.
Yeah. For anyone who's just listening, he's just moving his hands a few inches away from his body, kind of like giving himself Reiki, or like he's touching the energetic field around his body as opposed to touching his own body.
And this idea of magnetic passes, I think that there are two ideas within this. One is maybe metaphysical, or maybe it's not metaphysical. It's just based in the idea that there is a magnetism that is real. It is material, but it is not visible. And you are manipulating that energy with the hands, and it's primarily with the hands and not with other parts of the body. Because if you're doing magnetic passes, you're using your hands to do that. But the other idea behind this is that if you have your eyes open and you're standing in front of me and I'm doing passes with my hands, as you just described, you are going to activate parts of your nervous system based on where you see my hands. If I bring my hands down like this, you are actually starting to feel it in your face, in your body. And so there's an aspect of magnetic passes that is activating the ventral and dorsal vagal responses of the nervous system to trigger parasympathetic or relaxation response. And it has a sort of a calming effect. But I have to tell you, it's more than that. Because I myself have had experiences. I didn't entirely even believe this when I went for my first trainings in magnetism and mesmerism. I was very open-minded to it, but I was also still skeptical, as I am when I approach most things. And when I experienced it myself, it was absolutely positively done that magnetism and mesmerism is real. And I can't even begin to describe all the experiences that I have that have assured me of that. But there is something more than just the person's response to seeing the hand like this, because you can experience with the eyes closed, you can experience it from a distance. It's truly,
I mean, you're preaching to the choir, just so you know. I mean, a Taoist yoga, a huge part of it is doing healing on people and literally doing what you're describing. Not normally, there's certain, the Taoist system that I studied, Hualgong, has concepts where you can move the energy in people's body without touching them. And I would say it's interesting because we don't, in the Taoist tradition, we don't bring the mind into it. We don't bring suggestion into it necessarily. It's just about bringing the energy of someone. It's really about parasympathetic drive, like bringing all of the anxiety and all the thoughts that are in their head down to their belly. And when that happens, people become extremely relaxed, and just letting them be in that state, which we call Su Sung Hua Gong, water in the head, fire in the belly, itself is healing. Now, combining that with what you're talking about, I guess my question is that what Mesmer did? He brought people into these deep states of relaxation using this, what I would call chi, but I don't know what you would call it, magnetism, and then applying principles of suggestion like we were talking about earlier. Is that the full practice? What else is there to it?
This is one element of mesmerism, is very close to the way that you described it. However, mesmerism does not use verbal suggestions.
Oh, interesting.
The verbal suggestions and verbal hypnotism is engaging the mind, engaging the thoughts, engaging the imagery and the emotions in the way that I described before. But these are the practices of verbal hypnotism. Mesmerism is nonverbal. And so, yes, as a practitioner of both styles of hypnotism, I might use mesmerism, magnetism, the gaze, fascination in order to begin to induce a trance state. But then I might also bring in some suggestions. I typically do bring in some verbal suggestions to reinforce the ideas that the person is there for. But let's say that a person just wants to experience a trance or wants to experience a healing, that they don't have a particular objective to overcome dependency or to achieve a specific goal. In those cases, there is no reason for me to give verbal suggestions. We just want to do a healing. This is not the reason that people come to me as a hypnotist. They usually have a very specific and defined objective. But this is one aspect of mesmerism, very much the way that you described it, is about bringing the energy into, we think about the solar plexus actually, instead of the lower donjon or the belly. But it is all about bringing the healing energy of the earth up through the practitioner's, into the practitioner's body, and affecting that change in the individual. And to me, one of the fascinating things about mesmerism, magnetism, and these nonverbal practices is that my teacher, Marco Pere in Italy, he tells us at a certain point, don't even worry about your client. But, and what do I mean by that? Because that seems like a very funny statement to make. As a practitioner, I need to get myself into a state where I'm in that trance, where we do a very interesting experiment in the nonverbal hypnotism training, where my teacher, Dr. Perry, will have us do 3 styles of, let's say, a healing with our hands placed over someone's head and over the solar plexus. And they can do this either sitting or lying down. And what we do is we mix it up so that the person we've paired off with doesn't know which order we're going to do 1, 2, 3. let's say number one is I have my hands there. You could call this the control experiment. I have my hands here as the practitioner over the person's forehead and over their solar plexus, and I'm distracted. I'm looking at over there. I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch. I'm just looking around. I'm purposefully not engaged and distracted. Number two is you have the hands in the same place, just holding them there, not touching the body, but over those areas, and thinking, and this is, I think, how most people think of healing, is thinking, I'm sending energy to this person. I'm bringing the energy from the earth into this person. I'm loving this person. I'm healing this person, like this pouring forth of a maternal loving energy. I think that's what many people think is going to do the deed. But actually, it's the number three that consistently people feel is just having the hands there. And as a practitioner, opening my peripheral gaze and just being as still and present as I possibly can be and not even thinking about the person. That's the one that people will feel something in their forehead and feel something in their solar plexus. And it's very consistent.
It's like it's better to hold space for someone with non-judgment than it is to try to solve their problems for them. Like,
well said.
That's fascinating, because I've done healing in the second way that you've described. I've also done healing in the final way that you've described, not necessarily intentionally. I think I sometimes go back and forth between those modes. What is the deepest experience? You were talking about it earlier, where you were really getting excited about, like, you've had some powerful experiences through this practice. What's the deepest thing that you've experienced from this sort of healing work?
I had extraordinary experiences the second time I went for a training. We do a basic course and an advanced course, which I'm actually, at some point in 2025, I'm going to bring my teacher into the United States and start some of this training for people here in the United States. When I went the first time, I had a remarkable experience in learning and witnessing these practices. But when I went back the second time for the advanced training, I went through 3 mesmeric crises. Now, this is an aspect of, when we hear crisis, we think of a negative thing, but a crisis is having the flow of energy that takes place in such a way that there are actually things happening to you and to the body that you're not in control of.
So it's like a cathartic release, or like a trauma release experience. Yeah.
Yes. And it is.
Can you share one of them? Can you give us a little detail? If you don't mind, a personal story.
I don't mind. I'll try and recall. The way that this happened was, we volunteer in the class for who's going to come up and demonstrate this method with the teacher, and I'm pretty eager to volunteer usually. So I went into a place where, many times we're doing these practices with each other. And in one of them, early on in the second training that I did, I was aware, I was sitting in the chair. There were 2 people working with me or on me. And one person's hand was here over my forehead. And I began to feel very powerfully, and my eyes were closed, so I didn't know this. But having observed the methods, I kind of have an idea what they're doing. I began to feel very powerfully a pulsing in the third eye, or in the forehead, that was very truly remarkable. Not, am I feeling that? Am I not feeling that? But like, what is
no one said feel a pulse in your forehead.
No, this is completely nonverbal. Yeah,
right.
There's no conception really in that moment of where they are, what they're doing, other than the general idea that I've seen. We do passes and we hold the hands in certain places. That was the beginning of one of the experiences for me. But as that went on, and you go through, in many of these mesmeric states, we are falling backward. This might sound funny to someone to hear, but at a certain point, we can draw someone backward with the hands. We can have someone.
So you mean they were standing and then you kind of like cause them to fall back? Yeah.
Yeah. And I was caused to fall backward, and in the experience, and
so you were standing, you're standing when you receive this treatment, because I'm always thinking of people lying down because of my Taoist practice, but people typically stand when they're receiving mesmerism.
Oftentimes, many of the different methods that we use involve a person standing, but sometimes they're sitting.
So you were standing, they have their hand over your head. You're feeling a huge pulse in your forehead, third eye, whatever, and you started falling back.
That experience with the pulse in the third eye was actually when I was sitting, but in a later demonstration in the class, when I was standing and they started a certain process with me where we were talking about states of ecstasy and crisis. I was the subject, let's say, and after looking at the bright light, which we use light a lot, light affects the pineal gland and is a very powerful, it's a very powerful thing that we can use in mesmerism. And after looking at the light, I closed my eyes. And when I felt very strongly something pulling me backward, I allowed myself, because we have a certain trust with each other when we're working with each other in these methods. And I allow myself to fall backward. But when you're falling backward like this, and then they take you and they lay you down on the floor, you're in another world at that point.
Right. And you just went to another dimension. Yeah.
It is like another dimension. And at that moment, the spontaneity of images going through the mind and ideas and regression and seeing things from childhood, and the idea that people have of hypnotism, that there's going to be this like automatic replay of ideas and imagery and symbols and all sorts of things, was so remarkable to me. And also body movements that I was not in control of. Like whether it was my arm moving in a certain way or my legs moving in a certain way, my breathing. And what's really interesting to me is later on, I could watch the video of this.
Oh, wow.
And where I see my breathing change dramatically. And I didn't know this as I'm actually participating in this. I just think like, oh, my breathing just really changed. But when that happened, it's because someone came over there and put the hand here.
Did you have like spontaneous physical healing from that, from the weird movements you were doing? And also, how did that altered state that you experienced, how did that heal you or change you? And what did that do for you that made you so excited about it?
I did not have a spontaneous physical healing from that. Although in my first class there, my teacher took away my shoulder pain. I had shoulder pain when I would sleep at night. And so these do actually work there is a technique called the DePisa technique that comes from one of his masters that is very effective at taking away physical pain. And that worked on me. But this experience to me was even more remarkable because it allowed me, I'm not going to be too specific here because it's kind of personal, but it allowed me to get down to the root of a certain emotional response that I had to situations where I saw that started at a very, very early age. But the way that it's occurring is with such spontaneity and such vivid imagery in a way of playing back that there is an emotional catharsis that later on, the best way for me to put it, because I'm kind of rambling on this, is that
I get it. Yeah, but
absolutely opened my heart. My heart energy, my heart, this region of my body in the upper left quadrant I could feel it change physically, and my emotional engagement after that, being in the city of Rome after that, interacting with friends of mine, with other classmates, and even coming back to New York and being in my regular everyday life again and with my clients, it changed me. It opened something for me that had been shut down for quite a while. And it was really the most remarkable aspect of it to me was the imagery, the symbols, the things that I saw. It's difficult to describe if you don't experience.
I have an inkling of what you're talking about. I think that it sounds like you were able to recognize a pattern that you had, and you got to see its root in your childhood. And by seeing its root, tracing it back to its root and all the symbols on the way there and on the way back, it was almost like an enlightenment. Yes. That to use a Taoist term, we'd say you killed a heart demon. You know, in Taoism, we have this idea that there are these little that these past experiences or past traumas, or not even traumas. We use the word, I think the word trauma gets thrown around way too much. These past experiences become kind of things that cover up the heart. And in Taoism, they're called heart demons. And you blasted one open, and now you have full access to whatever energy that has been blocking before. Yeah. That's amazing. That sounds so cool. I want it.
It's a great way to put it. The way that you just put it is a great way to put it in. And the difference between verbal hypnotism and nonverbal hypnotism is that in verbal hypnotism, the way someone is going to go back to discover the source of the problem or the trauma is, let's say, for example, we go through a whole progressive relaxation that takes 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And then now that you're there, we are walking through a hallway and we're opening the door. And when we open the door, you're going to see something from your childhood. You know, I'm just trying to describe like a visual imagery based, like a classic visual imagery based relaxation method that then uses, like, you're coming down through the clouds, and when you descend through the clouds, you're going to start to have an image appear before you. And that's effective sometimes, but with mesmerism and magnetism, it's boom, you're there.
And the student is doing it themselves. Like, you don't have to plant the images. You're just using magnetism to help them access that.
Yeah. And in fact, I had 2 mesmeric crises in class. And then there was some unfinished work that I still needed to do. So I went back to my hotel room and I used the light, which we use the light. I have like a photo light that I use. It's a very bright light. We can also use the little flashlight in our phone. And I sat on the bed and I put the light there above eye level. And I looked at the light and I did the practice. There's certain things that we do at that moment. And I took the light down and I went back, and I had the most remarkable of all 3 by doing a self crisis.
Wow.
And it was, I'm not using the wrong words when I say it was actually a religious experience. It connected me to something that was, I don't know how to describe this without going on a huge long tangent, but it was a religious experience that I had, and it was just truly remarkable. I'm a believer. I'm not a believer. I'm a knower. I know absolutely 100% that mesmerism is real.
So you got to take us there. I mean, go on that tangent, please. Take us on the tangent. What happened?
Oh, I don't know really that I can, but it had to do with a lot of religious imagery and symbolism that was very, very meaningful to me, because as you alluded to in our conversation prior to this, you know that I'm highly involved in the Western esoteric tradition and the Gnostic, Rosicrucian, Martinist traditions. I've been involved in those traditions for a long time in the United States and administer some of those groups. And It was drawing upon some of the aspects of those traditions, but without my expectation of that at all. I thought it was something that's more personal to me. But there were some things that came in that were surprising, really surprising, actually, to me.
Okay, maybe this is a great transition. By the way, I'll be, given that so many of our audience are yogis, and not just Taoist yogis, but from Hatha tradition and Indian tradition, I think the term for the eliminating the heart demons is the impressions that are left on the soul, and the kind of the samskaras that we have to, the whole idea of yoga is eventually removing those until all that remains is the true self. So I see what you're describing. It sounds almost like a very powerful potential practice that people could do, even to themselves. But also, what the thought I had is, because you have a 20+ year deep interest and have done work as an active leader in the Western esoteric tradition, you have that whole backdrop of these ideas you've been circulating through your conscious mind for a long time, and so then perhaps that laid the groundwork for you to have this religious experience. Maybe you could talk a little bit, this is a perfect transition. What is Gnosticism, Rosicrucian, the different groups that you just described? Because I think some of my listeners will have no idea what that is. And what is the Western esoteric tradition?
Maybe the first thing that I'll say about my experience in relation to Western esotericism and how those images were in my mind is that because I was in Rome and I was visiting the Forum and ancient temples in the Scala Santa and all sorts of places that are very rich in meaning and also rich in energy, that I was highly engaged at the same time that I was there to take a class, and also doing some sightseeing and some study. And, I had a lot of that active in my mind and around me in my field, let's say. So that probably did prime me to have the experience that I had. What is the Western esoteric tradition? Western esoteric tradition, I would say, this is a difficult thing to define, but we're talking about societies and orders of initiation that ultimately all go back to Hellenic thought. They go back to Orphism. They go back to the idea that there is a transcendent oneness. There's an absolute that is, and that there's a hierarchy that comes or manifests out of that absolute. And this is the basis of cosmogonies in Western esoteric thought that recognize that there's not a separation between man and the divine, that it's a continuum.
And just for the uninitiated, Hellenistic, you're talking about ancient Greece, right? The original Orphic, is it?
Yeah, because ancient Greece is where the first conceptions of the soul come from with Plato, and going back to the historical Orpheus, which I think was around 1600 BC. Some people say even earlier than that. These were the very first conceptions that there is a divine aspect to man, that there's an immortal spark within one's nature, excuse me, that is the one and the same with the divine. And so Western esoteric tradition tends to...
Also in the Western tradition. In Eastern tradition, they also had, don't you think, I would say that there's a separate whole, we're talking Western tradition, but anyway.
Yeah.
No, I just don't want to people to be like, what? In the East, they've been talking about that for longer. I'm sure that
right. No, we're talking about Western esoteric tradition. So
great.
Because you could say that some of these things go back to Zoroastrianism. You could say that some of these things go
or back to the Vedas, or whether it came from the east to west, who knows? But we're talking about the beginning of Western concept of a soul, and the earliest that we have from it is ancient Greece.
Yes. Plato's conception of the soul. And this is where the modern conceptions that we have in the West come from. So the Western esoteric tradition, I would say, is the tradition of religious movements and orders that promote the idea that man has an immortal divine spark within. This is maybe an oversimplification of the idea, but that's the essence of the idea.
And is that idea, how is that related to Judaism and later Christianity? Would you say that idea persists in those traditions, or only in the Gnostic and Kabbalistic versions of those traditions?
Well, Christianity very early on comes out of Gnostic tradition. There are Gnosticism. Gnosis means knowledge.
Right.
The Gnostics were very early Christians who believed in a different cosmogony. Well, how do I put this? See, the problematic thing here is that people look upon Gnosticism as a heretical movement. And that's part of the propaganda. The Gnostics were the original Christians.
Right.
The original Christians did not adopt 4 canonical gospels and say this is the religion and move on from there. There were many different types of Christians. There was not just one type of Christianity at its origin, but there were many different sects, many different people. And so what happened over the ages is that the church, in order to unify Christianity in the early centuries of the Christian era, determined to use certain gospels that more or less matched each other, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and codified that as the New Testament, and took that along with the Hebrew books of the Old Testament and created that as the compendium of religion.
Right.
But since then, people have looked upon Gnosis as a heretical movement, but actually it comes out of the mixture of Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish belief systems in Alexandria at a very early time, right around the beginning of the Christian era, because of the empire of Alexander the Great was taking over many places where people were of different religions and
and they had the libraries. They had this tradition of bringing all those traditions together and putting the libraries, giving people access to those libraries.
Yeah, and I think a lot of things being exchanged on trade routes also between the East and the West, and that's why we can never really get down to the bottom ultimately of how far back do you go in history? Do you go to Atlantis or something like that? Some things are lost to history. So, right. but what is Gnosticism essentially is a group of ideas at the very beginning of the Christian era that come out of Alexandria originally, that are a mixture of the Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish belief systems, where people, for the first time, in order to live in a world where the Greek culture was overcoming many different civilizations, had to in order to participate in the intellectual life of their culture, had to adopt a more symbolic way of looking at things and a less literal way of looking at things.
That's that last piece. I had never heard that before, about the origins of Gnosticism being, in a way, a cultural phenomenon to help with what was the Hellenization of the Western world. It then. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt here, but because many people, because they were displaced from if the Hellenic culture was overtaking the world as it
Right.
did, many people felt like they were strangers in a strange land, and having to accommodate and adjust to this new culture. And so from this comes this idea of being an alien in the alien world. This is like an idea in Gnosticism that your true home is not in this world, that your true home is among the stars, and that
That's so fascinating.
you are imprisoned in the tomb of flesh, that you are not of this world, that you are far from your home, and that your soul is going to return to that place. This essential idea and conception of the soul being sort of dislocated and discontent and longing, it's a cultural phenomenon that created that idea. And so that appealed to people who felt very discontent with their new place in this civilization that was sort of radically changing around their time.
But then it later became, like, today it's seen more as, you know, I don't know, I'm skipping a lot of generations, but at some point it was like secret societies, kind of, maybe because the church had clamped down on it. Is that what happened?
Yes.
So like,
Yeah.
I've kept, was it Viserius, or there was almost a time where there was like a choice point where the new pope could have been like a Gnostic or not. I don't know. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
But they chose to kind of, like, anyone who had Gnostic beliefs, we kicked that out of the church. It was at like 300 AD or something, or
it was, I think the Council of Nicaea was one of the most, probably a big turning point for much of that, when there was a codification of what was regarded as Christian beliefs.
Right.
So, but this again, you know, there has been a portrayal. It's very interesting because there's been a portrayal of the Gnostics as being the ones who were aberrant to what was existing at that time. And that's part of the propaganda, is to say that these early Christian movements were the heretical movements. The earliest Christian movements were taking Serapis in Alexandria, which was a form of Osiris used primarily among the nobility when they would do something like a coronation of the new pharaoh or something like that. And Serapis, many of the ideas of Serapis were appropriated and incorporated with this messianic figure of Jesus. That what you have developed over time in the Christian idea of Jesus is a new hero figure who takes on many of the ideas that were common to Attis and Dionysus or Bacchus, Mithras, Serapis. You have essentially like this new figure who is sort of the conglomeration of many of the different traditions that existed prior to that time. Because again, you're in a time in history when people are, you know, you have Jews living next to Greeks and next to Egyptians. And so if you publicly have to worship this God, you still do the thing that your family taught you for generations in your home. And so maybe you use the same statue and the same prayers, but you call the God something different. I mean, a little arbitrary here about how this all played out, but there was a real mixing of traditions, out of which comes in many ways an oversimplification of religion. We have this idea that if we go back to the source, that we're going to find the one true thing.
Right,
and it's actually the opposite. If you go back,
you find more crazy,
many different
we
things.
got to go forward. I mean, so why, like, what should there are a lot of people who are either disillusioned with their religion of origin, especially in the modern world today. And there are probably a lot of people who are, you know, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably pretty open-minded about religion in one way or another. What would draw someone to Gnostic practices or philosophy today? And what would that look like for someone if they're just curious about this sort of thing?
Yeah, in terms of what would draw someone to it, I think that I find that people who come to the tradition are often looking for something that is not dictating to them how to live, that is recognizing the that each individual has within them that kernel of truth and a direct connection to the divine. So that's one thing. People generally seeking to engage in a tradition that is not about dogmas and doctrines, but is more about recognizing the nature of the soul and respecting that aspect, that immortal aspect of each individual. I think a lot of times people are drawn to the tradition by symbolism. There's something that resonates with them. I have a sense from being engaged in this tradition for a good number of years that a lot of people are just kind of, excuse me, just kind of born with this inclination. You have to question whether some of these inclinations that we have that draw us towards something are things that we are reincarnated with. You tend to, I think, bring into this lifetime ideas and movements that you've been engaged with before.
And is the practice, like if someone were to join the Gnostic church today, I know there's not one in every town. What would it be like? Is it going to a service? Is it reading certain texts? Is it a meditation? Is it, what is it like to be active in the Western esoteric tradition?
Yeah, there are a number of different ways that a person can practice Western esoteric tradition. And as far as the Gnostic church goes, Gnostic church is something that before the Gnostic church even existed in the late 1800s, and we would think about that as the rebirth of Gnosticism in a way. The Gnostic thought was primarily still being engaged among certain Roman Catholic clerics who did this and who were still engaged with these ideas, but not in an overt way, in a way that like was
secret.
Underground. Yeah.
I mean, the Vatican libraries have tons of Gnostic texts, I'm assuming, that are...
I would imagine so.
Yeah.
But we also have a plethora of Gnostic texts that were discovered in the Nag Hammadi findings around Qumran. The people who lived in the caves around Qumran and refused to live under Roman rule in Judea, they went to live in the caves, and this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls originate. So there's an idea that these are some of the essential Gnostic texts. The Nag Hammadi codes or the Nag Hammadi codices are some of the essential Gnostic texts. But the Gnosticism existed as a movement even before the Gnostic church. I'm not talking about ancient Gnosticism, but more among what was, first of all, as I said, Roman Catholic clerics who were still engaged with these ideas, but also among certain high-level Freemasons, among Rosicrucians, among a lot of the nobility in Europe throughout the ages. You could even say maybe going back to probably, I can think even going back to 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, where you already see some of the formation of these ideas that then manifest as the Rosicrucian movement in the 1600s.
I mean, whenever you have a large religious organization, which we don't realize that religion and government and politics were the same up until 1776, and really now it's just taking on different forms. But whenever you have the suppression of a particular idea by the majority, there will be people within that then safeguard or protect it or hold on to it for the reason that typically the reason why an idea is suppressed is to maintain power. My background, by the way, is religious. This is what I kind of studied in college. My degree was in religious studies and psychology, and I was always fascinated by the history of religion and how what ideas get made canon, and how maybe some of the best ideas get snuck in, and then there's like little breadcrumbs, and then the most the teachings that are the most potent are often hidden and removed from the texts that are given to the masses. Yeah. And then they could either be used by the elite or lost over time. But I also believe that those teachings are eternal and able to be accessed through the individual, just like we've talked about how magnetism is this principle that doesn't require, it's so simple in a way.
Yeah. I think the way that you just put it is a great way of describing the Western esoteric tradition, or defining Western esoteric tradition. It's a tradition that maintains and preserves many of the ideas that were locked away from the average person for the sake of establishing or codifying a certain power structure and in a certain standard.
And just to give a real Reader's Digest version, those ideas would have been like how you could have a direct relationship with God, how certain practices of how to think about God, and it would also have been maybe some lifestyle practices, or are there other or rituals that help you to have those realizations?
Yeah. And I think that gets to your question about like, what does participation look like? In the Gnostic Church, we have a mass. It's not the Roman Catholic Mass, but it's also not the Crowley Mass, the Aleister Crowley Mass, which took the name of the Gnostic Church and did something completely different.
Like, you don't all wear masks, and like, or maybe you do. I don't know.
Well, what I'm referring to here is that there were certain sex practices that people took, and they called those Gnostic, and they promote that idea into what was called the Gnostic Catholic Ecclesia, but they appropriated the name of the original Gnostic Church, which is the one that I'm affiliated with, that comes out of Paris and Lyon in France in the late 1800s, and has nothing to do with any of that. And the only reason I'm saying that is because a lot of times if someone goes on the internet and they look up Gnostic Mass, they're going to find something that actually doesn't represent what the Gnostic Church is.
So no orgies in the real Gnostic Church.
That's right.
Okay.
and well, yeah, there's a Aleister Crowley is like a sex mass, which has the naked woman on the altar. This isn't exactly, I'm
that sounds like a good time, but I mean,
but
sorry, that's totally a joke.
The idea is that there are rituals, it's worship.
Right.
What I would say is that the principles of tradition are, there's theurgy, which is the worship of the gods. There is philosophy, which is knowledge and study. There is what else do we have? Theurgy, philosophy.
Isn't there some kind of mentorship, or like is that part of it?
The things that you hear, the oral tradition that's passed on. There's certain pillars, but a lot of it is ritual. A lot of it is
I think this is a perfect, by the way, place to like put a button on it, because we could do a whole other talk on this, which I'm really itching to do another time. But I think this is so really fascinating. I see the connection too with mesmerism and the healing. I believe we're trying to help people heal themselves, and we're trying to reconnect with the earth and with God and divine, whatever you want to call it. And that's the kind of teachings that I want to share with people, and that I want to highlight. So I'm so excited for you coming to the festival this summer. Some of the workshops we're thinking of doing with John are principles of trance suggestion and imagery, principles of trance suggestion and mesmerism. And now I'm understanding maybe there's a self-hypnosis that people could do. I don't know. You'll have to, and maybe we'll even have something on esoteric history of hypnosis. But this stuff I think this is a great introductory conversation. We can continue it. We're going to have to wrap for time in a minute here. But is there anything, as far as people being able to connect with you. I know you're hard to book, but it is possible to connect with you. Is there anything that you want to share or plug as we kind of close up here on this conversation?
Sure. If you go to my website, you can find there's soon going to be a self-hypnosis course available there. Some of these things are in the final stages just in terms of being accessible. You can find recordings and guided meditations for a variety of different issues that come up. You can, of course, read lots of resources there. So that's my website, johnmongiovi.com.
And I see you have 45 recordings on it right now.
Yeah, there are a good number of recordings there. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, please visit my website and take a look at what's there. And
you're leading a clinical hypnotism course, like for people that want to learn to become hypnotists.
Yeah.
When is that?
January through March 2025 here in New York, every other weekend. It's an 80-hour course for 5 weekends.
And it's certified by a particular tradition, or?
You become a certified hypnotist by the National Guild of Hypnotists. I'm one of their certified instructors. So I want to make, because we're using the terms tradition sometimes and also in reference to hypnotism, that I just want to make it clear that like the aspects of Gnosticism and Western Esotericism that we've discussed, they are historically related, but they have nothing to do with my practice of hypnotism, which is a very professional practice of hypnotism and hypnotherapy. And I don't bring those aspects into my practice, but it absolutely is the foundation of who I am as a person and the way that I see things in a metaphysical way and in a spiritual way, even if it's not an overt thing that I'm discussing, because it's not necessary in order to help a person with the problem.
Oh, of course, 100%. John, this was really fascinating. The time flew by. I guess we were in a trance at some point. It's funny, you talk about fascination. I remember the moment where my eyes opened up, it was when you first started explaining what mesmerism really was. I'm so grateful to learn this. And hopefully we'll go in deeper in the next one. Thank you so much. We're going to wrap here. Any final words?
Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone.
Peace, peace.